everybody, and welcome back to Julie's Orchids. Today we have a Care Collab, and I'm very happy this is my second Care Collab in this genre. I'm quickly just going to go over what a Care Collab is because it's been quite some time since Nina, the Ninja Orchid Nina, has called the Care Collabers to participate, and quite happy and excited to do so. So a Care Collab is where YouTube growers from all over the world make videos to discuss the care and cultivation of an orchid or a genre of orchids in their specific growing environment and conditions. The aim of the Care Collab is to help other growers that may not have a YouTube channel or are new to growing orchids or are interested to start growing orchids, to give them ideas on how they can go about doing it. And because it's a global Care Collab, people from all over the world can find a grower involved in the Care Collab that will be similar to their growing environment and conditions and can get some tips and tricks on those. So for today's Care Collab, there are 20 channels, including mine, participating. They all have their own challenges and tips and tricks to help you grow your slipper orchids to the best of your abilities. So we've got you covered pretty well from Australia, United States, France, the UK, and even up into our Nordic countries. The Care Collabers, we've got you covered. And today's Care Collab is on the orchid subfamily, and I cannot pronounce it, so I'll put it up here on the screen. Basically, the subfamily today is Slipper Orchids, and I'm excited for this one today because the first Care Collab I got to be involved with was on Slipper Orchids, and the gracious Nina over at Ninja Orchids invited me, and I was quite honored. So this is going to be a follow-up on what I've learned in caring for my slipper orchids since then. And you'll see that there's been quite a few changes on my care and cultivation, transferring from organic media to inorganic media. And I'll sort of discuss those things as well. But before we go any further, let's list out the channels that are participating in today's Care Collab. I'll put links to their channels down below in the comment section, so do have a look there. You can link to their channels. Without any further ado, today's Care Collabers are Hello Plant Lovers, The Orchid Saga, Ed's Orchids, Karin's Orchids, HillBilly Orchids, Fernanda Nascimento's Orchids and Succulents, Trish's Orchid Life, Tropical Plants Finland, Simply Orchids, etc., Orchids by the Lake, Mary G. Orchids and More, Beauty of Orchid and Plants, Dee Dee Blooms, Danielle's Orchid Ranch, The Right Paph, Joyous Orchids, Tokyo World Marc, MattbyNature, and of course the lovely Nina over at Ninja Orchids. In the orchid subfamily of slipper orchids, there are 5 different genres, and those would be Cryptopediums, Mexipediums, Paphiopedilums, Phragmipediums, and Selenoipediums. Slipper orchids are thought to have originated in Central America. Their habitat extends from Central America and can be found from the northern aspect of South America through parts of North America, including Canada, Europe, and beyond. There is a single species of slipper orchid in Europe. The northern African country of Algeria also hosts slipper orchids. However, no other place in Africa has slipper orchids, neither does Australia. The genre Paphiopedilum extends slipper habitat further across the globe, and they can be found from southern China down through the tropical southeastern portions of Asia. So it's important to know where your slipper orchid comes from for its care and its culture, because some of them will differ. For today's Care Collab, I'm going to concentrate on the 2 most common genre of slipper orchids grown and cultivated by the orchid hobbyist, and those would be Phragmipediums and Paphiopedilums. So Phragmipediums can be found from Central and Northern South America, and Paphiopedilums are your Asian slipper orchids. Now, it's important to remember, particularly with your paphs in particular, they have a very large range that they grow through, from tropical to subtropical, all the way up to the northern sort of boreal cooler temperatures. So it is very important to know the heritage of your slipper orchid so that you can give it the correct care. Some of the Paphiopedilums do require cooler growing environment, and some of the frags require it to be a bit warmer. However, I have found in my experience, that you can keep them quite happy in intermediate conditions. Basically, if you're pretty comfortable in your home, they're pretty comfortable. They do need brighter filtered light. And in regards to Paphiopedilums, I do find that the Paphiopedilums with the just plain green leaves require a bit more light than the mottled leaf kind. Now, don't be afraid of growing Frags or Paphs. Particularly, I think they're good for new orchid growers, because new orchid growers tend to be a bit heavy on the watering. And this is where I find these two subgenres of orchids to be really good for the beginner orchid grower. So if you've successfully been growing houseplants, it's easy enough to transition over to Paphs and Frags, because Paphs and Frags are considered terrestrial orchids, and they do not in any way, shape, or form like to dry out. They like to be evenly moist, not sopping wet, but moist all the time. They do fine in either bark, organic media, or inorganic media. This is where it's going to be important for the new grower to kind of see what works best for them, and I'll discuss potting media and my change that I've made since the last Care Collab. So I'll put a link to the Care Collab here from last time, and you guys can have a watch that if you want to and see how I've changed things with my growing of them. But the big thing is I've changed from organic bark and peat mixture to inorganic pumice. Now, the reason I made the switch was because I had a bug in one of my frags, and I'll put a link to that video here on when I made the change. I'll also kind of point out that for the first year and a bit that I was growing these, I was growing them in the bark medium. And because these plants do like to be moist all the time, I was finding that I was having a lot of problems with a couple things. First off, the fungus gnats were insane. Second off, the media here, being as wet as it is, would degrade very quickly, and I was finding that, I'm having to repot these every 8-9 months, particularly more frequently than that when I was experiencing the bad bark saga, which is what ultimately made me switch everything over to pumice. When you grow them in organic media, such as bark or sphagnum moss, because they have to be kept pretty damp all the time, you have a higher risk if growing indoors of molds occurring in the pot. Nice breeding ground for whatever that bug thing was. A lot of media breakdown very quickly. Acidification of your soils, which not good for the plants to a certain degree. Frags like a little bit more acidic, but not that much. Cost savings for me was switching from an organic media that breaks down very rapidly in my environment to an inorganic media that has similar water retentive properties and some wicking abilities to get everything towards the top of the pot. They have responded very well to the change from organic to inorganic media. One thing very nice about particularly Frags and Paphs, it seems like they really kind of do like to be repotted, and they do tend to put out a flush of new growths shortly after a repotting, which is always a bonus. So I keep my Frags and Paphs in the same mixture. They get pretty well the same amount of light, maybe distance from the lights are altered a bit, but for the most part they're running on the same light. I have an 80-watt LED full spectrum white light that they're running off of. They tend to really like it. They are in a new growing room because I've just moved into the new grow room, so they're also getting a bit more sunlight than they have, so I'm still working with that one. But I've currently got several of my Paphs in bud. So got one there in bud, one there in bud. This one's got 2 buds, and that one's got 1 bud. So I'm really not complaining about the Paphs. They seem to be going along really well. And the transfer over into the pumice, like I said, they just took off with it. Now, one thing I'm going to mention about the pumice is on my smaller seedling size plants, or the plants that have thinner, smaller roots, I put them in very small pumice and only very small pumice. The bigger, more established flowering size plants that have the bigger, thicker roots are in a mixture of small and what I'm calling large pumice, pieces that are about that big or so, mixed with very small, millimeter sized pieces. And there are some microfiber cloths running through the pot. Like a pot this size will have 1 microfiber cloth, but I do have a water level in my plant. So my plants are sitting in, a semi-hydro setup with the water level at the bottom, and running through the middle of it up to the top, I do have a microfiber cloth. In pots of this size, that's how I have it. In pots of that size, it's just straight small bark. Now I'm going to zoom in here and you can see that they're really liking the pumice. It doesn't matter what size pumice I've got it in, the roots really like it. And again, one thing to keep in mind with slipper orchid roots, paphs and frags, they do not like to be dry. They do not like to be exposed to air. That's the quickest way to kill them. So just keep that in mind, that they do like to be evenly moist, damp-ish throughout the pot. They don't want to be soaking wet. If the roots grow down into the water reservoir, it does not seem to affect them that bad. Now, I will say, as a caveat to that, in my climate, particularly in the summertime, the water reservoirs do dry out between waterings, but the pumice stays evenly damp throughout the pot. So now we're having a look here at some of my frags. I have slipper orchids ranging in size from recently deflasked seedlings, out of flask for about a year now that I made a swap with someone, to seedlings that I've bought from the local orchid nurseries that are growing on and now making their new growths. And then I do have some adult size and blooming plants that I did spend a little bit of more extra money on just to be able to get some blooms. The reason I did that is because paphs and frags are notoriously slow growers, with Paphiopedilums being exceedingly slow growers. Paphiopedilums can take sometimes up to 2 years to grow a new fan and bloom it, whereas Phragmipediums tend to grow a new fan and bloom it within a year, year and a half. If you get their culture right. Now, I put mine a little bit back. My big 3 back there were put back a little bit when I went on holiday. The person that came to water and care for the plant got some water in the crown of the back fans, and I was struggling a little bit with some crown rot, but somehow managed to keep it from spreading and extending. So we've got new growths coming off there, but my big frags, all 3 of them in the back, have been a bit set back because of that. And again, with my frags and the pumice, I have them set up in the exact same setup. The smaller seedling size frags are in the millimeter size pumice, and the bigger frags are in a mixture of the small and what I call the large pumice, with microfiber cleaning cloths, strips cut up through them to help pick the water up from the water reservoir. And again, the roots that have grown into the water reservoir don't seem to be rotting. They don't seem to mind it. They seem to have adapted to it just fine. And again, with my frags, I do find that particularly in the heart and the heat of summer, my water reservoir does dry out by the next Saturday. So the inside of the pumice still remains moist enough to keep the roots from dying off. So far I've made it through a summer with these, and I was a bit worried about the changeover to pumice because the summers here become exceedingly dry, and it just sucks the moisture out of everything. Okay, so we've discussed potting medium. You can grow them in organic or inorganic media. You can grow them in leca. You can grow them in pumice. The choice is really up to you. You'll have to do a little bit of trial and error to see what works best in your climate, in your individual growing conditions. Proceed with some caution, but do understand that frags and paphs both tend to be really resilient, particularly when going through a repotting. It does seem to be, in my experience, that you give them a repot and they're like, oh wait, I got a new home, I need to put down some more roots, and it does tend to trigger rooting, which makes them transition from organic to inorganic media really fairly easily. As far as slipper orchids or orchids in general go, I do think that frags and paphs are a great starter orchid, particularly for the houseplant enthusiast, because they do require a bit more heavy-handed watering, similar to houseplants. They grow fine, just fine in indoor conditions like houseplants. They require, different lights. I do augment mine with LED full spectrum grow lights, but if you've got good windows and can give them bright, filtered indirect light, they should do fine there as well. My windows, I can't accommodate bright, indirect filtered light. They either get blasted with morning sun or they get blasted with afternoon sun. So that's why I have them sort of on these grow lights and in these grow shells. But no, Phragmipediums and Paphiopedilums are really easy to grow, cultivate, bloom, and rebloom in your homes easily enough. Keep them moist, give them bright filtered light, fertilize them sparingly. You know, if I'm going to be fertilizing my plants or using calcium and magnesium, if I'm using an orchid-specific fertilizer, I'll fertilize all of the rest of my plants, sort of 100, 150 parts per million for the smaller plants, 200, 220 parts per million for the bigger plants, for the Caddisecinae when they're really going like 300 parts per million. However, slipper orchids, I give them very little. So they'll get 75 parts per million of fertilizer or 75 parts per million of calcium, magnesium, or seaweed, and they'll get that once a growing season. That's it. Other time it's just pure water. What they have a really hard time with if they get too much nutrients or too much salt buildup is they get leaf tip burn, and that's very easy to get on these. So if you fertilize these, take your orchid fertilizer and cut that in half and then in half and just give them the littlest tiny bits of fertilizer very infrequently. Okay, so I grow slipper orchids in my home in a controlled environment in Western Australia. I use LED grow lights, full spectrum white LED grow lights that are on timers. When it's summertime out here, I have my lights for my slipper orchids running, 12. And then I bring that down to 8 to 10 to 12 hours, depending on what season we're going in, fall, autumn, or spring. So that is the Care Collab on slipper orchids, specifically the genres of Phragmipedium and Paphiopedilum. I'm going to leave you today with Winston. This is the plant I call Winston. So this is Paph Winston Churchill Indomitable by Paph in Charm White in Charm. This is a reliable bloomer for me. This is my third reblooming of this plant, and you can see it's a nice big juicy one. Unfortunately, it did not open in time for the Care Collab. I also have still in bud Paph Idiote, who is putting out yet her third bud, which I thought this plant only did 2 flowers, but it's budding again. And my Paph Spicerianum has got 1, 2 going on this one. Back to Winston. If you like the video, please give me a thumbs up. A subscribe would be great. Do be sure to check out the other channels participating in the Care Collab. You might find someone somewhere in the world close to your growing conditions, your climate, growing in the same sort of media you're interested in. So do check out the links down below in the comment section. Thank you guys again for watching, and have a lovely day.